In the dusty archives of the Blackwood Historical Society, time stands still. Photographs from another era stare back at us with solemn eyes, their stories seemingly lost to the ages. But sometimes, those stories refuse to stay buried. They whisper from the yellowed pages of history, demanding to be heard, insisting that we look deeper into the faces captured in silver and light. The Victorian era was a time of remarkable contradiction, of rigid social propriety, masking often turbulent private lives, of scientific advancement racing alongside superstition, of photography emerging as both art and evidence. It was a time when sitting for a portrait was a solemn affair, an occasion marked by starched collars and Sunday best, when the camera was still novel enough to inspire both fascination and unease. The year was 1868 when the Caldwell family sat for what would become one of the most enigmatic images in photographic history. 7 figures arranged in the formal posture typical of the era. Father seated center, mother beside him, 4 children arranged by height, and standing behind them all, a figure whose identity would baffle historians and researchers for over a century. A single image, captured in a moment, yet containing a mystery that would stretch across generations. A portrait that appears at first glance to be nothing more than a typical family memento of its time, yet holds within its frame a story of obsession, deception, and tragedy. Welcome to Shadow Frames. I'm your host, and today we unravel the mystery of the Caldwell family portrait, a photograph studied for years, until one face changed everything. The photograph arrived at the Blackwood Historical Society in 1952, donated by an elderly woman named Margaret Winters, who claimed to have found it among her late grandmother's possessions. The portrait was housed in an ornate wooden frame, its gilded edges tarnished with age but still elegant, the kind of frame that would have adorned the parlor wall of a respectable family. The glass covering the image was slightly clouded, as if the years had breathed upon it, but the photograph beneath remained remarkably well preserved. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than another Victorian family portrait. Somber faces, stiff postures, the long exposure time of early photography demanding complete stillness from its subjects. In this era, before the casual snapshot, photographs were serious business, requiring careful preparation and considerable expense. Families dressed in their finest clothing, arranged themselves according to social convention, and held perfectly still, sometimes with the aid of hidden braces and stands, for up to a minute while the plate was exposed. The Caldwell portrait followed these conventions faithfully. Thomas Caldwell, a man of perhaps 40, sat in a heavy wooden chair, his beard neatly trimmed, his suit impeccably tailored, one hand resting on a small table beside him. Elizabeth Caldwell stood at his side, her dark dress adorned with lace at the collar, her hair parted in the middle and drawn back severely from her face. Her expression, like her husband's, was solemn. Smiling in photographs was uncommon in this period, partly due to the long exposure times and partly due to the cultural notion that photography was a serious business, not unlike sitting for a painted portrait. The 4 Caldwell children were arranged before their parents in descending order of height. William, the eldest at 12, standing straight in a suit that mimicked his father's. The twins James and Mary, aged 8, positioned side by side, their matching features evident despite their different clothing, and little Catherine, just 4 years old, seated on a small stool at the front of the grouping, her white pinafore starched and pristine, a ribbon visible in her neatly combed hair. The donation might have been forgotten entirely, filed away with countless other artifacts from the period, if not for Dr. Harrison Mercer, the Society's lead archivist at the time. Something about the portrait caught his eye, something he couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps it was the unusual intensity of the subject's gazes, or some subtle detail that his trained eye detected, but his conscious mind couldn't immediately identify. "There's something not right about this photograph," he wrote in his journal, the entry dated October 3, 1952. "I've examined hundreds of daguerreotypes and ambrotypes from this period, but this one makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The composition is conventional enough, and yet there is a quality to it, a tension, perhaps, that I find deeply unsettling." For 3 months, Dr. Mercer studied the portrait whenever time allowed. He pored over it with a magnifying glass, examining every detail, every shadow and highlight. He researched the Caldwell family, diving into census records, church registries, newspaper archives, and town meeting minutes. Slowly, a picture emerged, not just of the family in the photograph, but of their lives and the world they inhabited. Thomas Caldwell, he discovered, had been a moderately successful merchant in the town of Millfield, Massachusetts, a bustling textile manufacturing center during the mid-19th century. Thomas had opened a dry goods store in 1855, and by the time of the photograph, his business had expanded to include 2 locations in town. He was known as a fair businessman, active in the local Congregational church, and occasionally mentioned in town records as contributing to various civic improvements, the construction of a new schoolhouse, the paving of Main Street, donations to the volunteer fire brigade. Elizabeth Caldwell, née Harrington, came from a respected family in neighboring Westfield. Her father had been a physician, her mother the daughter of a minister. Elizabeth was educated at a ladies' seminary in Boston, unusual for the time, suggesting the Harringtons valued education for their daughters as well as their sons. She married Thomas in 1855, and according to parish records, was active in church charity work and the local temperance society. The couple had 4 children: William, born in 1856, twins James and Mary, born in 1860, and little Catherine, born in 1864. School records indicated that William was a promising student, particularly in mathematics and Latin. The twins were still in primary education at the time of the photograph, while Catherine, of course, was too young for formal schooling. A respectable, prosperous family, Dr. Mercer noted in his research. Precisely the sort one would expect to commission a formal portrait in this period. Nothing in their background suggests anything unusual or extraordinary. But it was the 7th figure in the photograph that drew Dr. Mercer's attention, the tall man standing behind the family, partially in shadow. According to town records, the Caldwells employed no live-in staff. Thomas had one business partner, but that man was described in multiple sources as short and portly, nothing like the tall, slender figure in the photograph. Mercer consulted Millfield's employment records, tax rolls, and business directories. He examined Thomas Caldwell's business correspondence, preserved in the town's historical collection. He reviewed church membership lists and social club rosters. Nowhere could he find any mention of a man who might correspond to the figure in the photograph. The mysterious 7th subject remains unidentified, he wrote. He appears to be a man of perhaps 30 to 40 years, tall and thin, dressed formally in a manner consistent with the period. His features are somewhat indistinct, whether due to movement during exposure or some defect in the photographic process, I cannot determine. But his presence is undeniable, and his relationship to the family unexplained. In December of 1952, Dr. Mercer invited photographer and photography historian Elliot Palmer to examine the portrait. Palmer had written extensively on the development of photographic techniques in the 19th century and had consulted for several major museums on their historical photography collections. If anyone could shed light on the technical aspects of the Caldwell portrait, it would be Palmer. The 2 men met in Mercer's office at the Historical Society, a room lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves, the portrait laid carefully on a felt-covered table beneath a bright desk lamp. Palmer, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses and prematurely white hair, bent over the photograph, examining it first with the naked eye, then with a jeweler's loupe. Palmer was initially unimpressed. "It's a well-preserved example of 1860s portraiture," Palmer noted in his assessment, speaking in the clipped, precise manner for which he was known. "The technique is competent, if not exceptional. The photographer used adequate lighting, though there's some fall-off toward the edges, common for the period. The plate preparation appears thorough, with minimal spotting or irregularities in the emulsion." He adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to the image. "I see nothing particularly remarkable about it. The composition is standard, the subjects appropriately posed. The slight blurring around young Catherine is common. Children often struggle to remain still for the long exposure times required. 30 seconds to a minute of absolute stillness was a challenge for adults. For a child of 4, nearly impossible. The photographer has done a creditable job despite this difficulty." Dr. Mercer pushed back. "Look at the man in the back. Who is he?" Palmer studied the photograph more carefully, directing his attention to the 7th figure. "A relative, perhaps? An uncle or cousin visiting from out of town?" The formal nature of the portrait suggests a family connection. Strangers were rarely included in such intimate domestic images. "No," Mercer replied, spreading out his research notes beside the photograph. "I've traced the family tree. Thomas had no brothers, and Elizabeth's only brother died in 1861. Her father passed away in 1859 and Thomas's father in 1850. There's no record of this man anywhere in the family's documented history. Palmer shrugged, his scientific skepticism evident. Then a friend or business associate. These things weren't always documented. Not every relationship leaves a paper trail, especially in smaller communities where social connections were often informal and fluid. Perhaps, Mercer conceded. But don't you find it odd that in all my research, and I've been quite thorough, there's not a single mention of anyone matching this description in connection with the Caldwells? No business correspondence, no mention in Thomas's journals, no record in church or social registries. Palmer frowned, taking a second look at the photograph. The figure is unusually positioned, he admitted. In formal portraits of this era, non-family members were typically placed at the periphery of the grouping, not centrally behind the family, as we see here. And yet, the lighting on this figure is consistent with the rest. If he were added to the image later, through double exposure or plate manipulation, I would expect to see some inconsistency in the lighting or the density of the image. But I don't. Technically speaking, this appears to be a straightforward photograph of 7 people, but Dr. Mercer remained troubled. He commissioned a higher quality reproduction of the photograph, employing the most advanced photographic copying techniques available in the early 1950s. Under magnification, the reproduction revealed something peculiar about the mysterious 7th figure. While the Caldwell family all gazed directly at the camera with the stiff formality of the era, the man in the back appeared to be looking slightly to the side, at little Catherine. "Do you see it?" Mercer asked Palmer when the photographer returned for a second consultation in January 1953. The direction of his gaze. Palmer studied the enlarged image, his scientific detachment visibly disturbed. "Yes," he admitted reluctantly. "He does appear to be looking at the child rather than at the camera. Most unusual for a formal portrait of this period, when subjects were explicitly instructed to face the camera directly. And there's something else," Mercer added, pointing to a detail in the enhanced image. "Look at his hand." Palmer leaned closer. In the higher quality reproduction, it was just possible to discern that the mysterious figure's right hand was extended slightly, the fingers unusually long and thin, reaching toward, but not quite touching, Catherine's shoulder. "A peculiarity of posture," Palmer suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Or perhaps an artifact of the reproduction process. Or," Mercer said quietly, "something more significant." By 1954, Dr. Mercer had assembled a small but comprehensive file on the Caldwell family, piecing together their history from fragments scattered across various archives and records. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. The picture emerged slowly, incompletely, tantalizingly. The Caldwells, he discovered, had lived in a handsome federal-style house on Elm Street, one of Millfield's more prestigious addresses. The house still stood, though it had been converted into a law office in the early 20th century. Thomas's dry goods business had prospered throughout the 1860s and early 1870s, expanding to include a small manufacturing operation producing men's shirts and collars, a natural extension of his textile trade. Elizabeth, according to church records and the diaries of several Millfield Society women, was known as an accomplished hostess, though described as somewhat nervous in disposition and given to fanciful notions. One diarist noted that Elizabeth claims to hear music when none is playing, and speaks of shadows that move of their own accord. These comments were made in 1869, a year after the photograph was taken. Thomas and Elizabeth both died in the winter of 1876 during an influenza outbreak that claimed nearly 40 Millfield residents. Thomas was 52, Elizabeth 48, relatively young but not unusually so for the period, when even prosperous Americans could expect shorter lifespans than their modern counterparts. William, the eldest son, took over his father's business at the age of 20 and ran it successfully until his death in 1922. He married late, at 34, to a woman named Clara Thornton and had 3 children of his own. William expanded the manufacturing side of the Caldwell business, eventually focusing exclusively on shirt production and closing the retail stores. By the turn of the century, Caldwell and Sons employed over 100 workers and had contracts with retailers throughout New England. The twins, James and Mary, both married and moved away from Millfield, James to Boston and Mary to New York. James became an accountant, married the daughter of his employer, and had 2 sons. Mary married a widowed doctor with a young daughter and had no children of her own. Both lived unremarkable lives by most standards, achieving moderate prosperity and social standing in their adopted cities. James died of heart failure in 1930, Mary of pneumonia in 1934, but it was Catherine's fate that troubled Mercer most. In the spring of 1870, 2 years after the photograph was taken, 5-year-old Catherine Caldwell vanished from the family home. According to newspaper accounts from the time, the child had been playing in the garden under the supervision of a nursemaid. The maid stepped inside for no more than a few minutes to fetch a shawl. The spring afternoon had grown chilly, and when she returned, Catherine was gone. The disappearance triggered a massive search. The entire town of Millfield mobilized to find the missing child. Men formed search parties, combing the woods and fields surrounding the town. The nearby river was dragged. Houses and barns were searched. Thomas Caldwell offered a substantial reward, $500, an enormous sum at the time, for information leading to Catherine's return. But despite the extensive efforts, despite the involvement of police from as far away as Boston, despite the reward that would have represented several years' wages for a working man, no trace of the child was ever found. Could there be a connection? Mercer wrote in his notes, dated June 12, 1954. The unidentified man in the photograph, taken in 1868, the strange way he looks at Catherine, her disappearance 2 years later in 1870. The way Elizabeth Caldwell was described as nervous and fanciful in the year between, speaking of moving shadows and unheard music. Is it possible she sensed some danger to her child? And what of the figure's extended hand, reaching toward Catherine but not quite touching her, as if in anticipation? He underlined the final question 3 times, then added, a premonition captured on film, or something more sinister, evidence of a predator who had already marked his victim. But without further evidence, the case grew cold. Dr. Mercer continued his research when time allowed, but other projects demanded his attention. He retired in 1957, and the Caldwell photograph was once again filed away, its mysteries unresolved, waiting in the darkness of the archive for someone new to discover its secrets. 20 years passed. The world changed dramatically, culturally, politically, technologically. Photography techniques advanced from the chemical processes of the 19th century to the electronic imaging of the late 20th. What had once been a rare and expensive undertaking, the creation of a family portrait, became commonplace, as instant cameras, color film, and automated processing made photography accessible to virtually everyone. In this new era, the Blackwood Historical Society received a grant to preserve and digitize its collection. The goal was to create a comprehensive archive that would protect fragile historical materials from degradation while making them more accessible to researchers and the public. A team of archivists, conservators, and graduate students began the painstaking process of cataloging, preserving, and digitizing thousands of documents, photographs, and artifacts. Among the items selected for priority digitization was the Caldwell portrait. Its unusual provenance, and Dr. Mercer's extensive notes about its mysteries, had earned it a place in the significant photographs category established by the preservation team. Thus, a new generation of historians and archivists encountered the Caldwell portrait, and Dr. Mercer's notes reignited interest in the mystery. Several of the graduate students involved in the digitization project became particularly fascinated with the case, spending their free time pursuing lines of inquiry that Mercer had been unable to follow due to the limitations of his era. One of these students, Michael Chen, discovered a journal kept by William Caldwell during the years following Catherine's disappearance. The journal, part of a private collection donated to the Massachusetts State Archives in 1965, had never been connected to the Blackwood Historical Society's materials. In it, William, 14 at the time of his sister's disappearance, recorded his family's devastation. "Father is like a man possessed," he wrote in May 1870. "He barely sleeps, spending each night out with the search parties, calling Catherine's name until his voice fails him. During the day, he visits every house in town, questioning everyone again and again, as though some new information might emerge if only he asks once more. Mother has taken to her bed. The doctor has prescribed laudanum for her nerves, but it brings her little peace. I hear her weeping throughout the night, and sometimes talking, as though Catherine were still in the house. The twins do not understand. They keep asking when Catherine will return, and no one has the heart to tell them she may never come home." Later entries documented the gradual disintegration of the once stable household. Thomas Caldwell's business suffered as he neglected it in favor of his increasingly desperate search for his daughter. Elizabeth's mental state deteriorated further, with William describing her conversations with empty air and her insistence that she could hear Catherine's voice coming from behind the walls. By autumn of 1870, the family's tragedy had taken a toll on young William as well. "I dream of her every night," he wrote, "not as she was when she disappeared, but as she was in the photograph, standing beside the tall man who waits in the shadows. In my dreams, he reaches for her, and she takes his hand willingly, turning away from us, walking into darkness. I wake calling her name, but there is never any answer." Chen's discovery added a new dimension to the mystery, suggesting that the Caldwell portrait had troubled the family themselves, not just later researchers. Had they, too, seen something unsettling in the image? Had the mysterious seventh figure disturbed them as it had Dr. Mercer decades later? Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a specialist in 19th century photography who had been brought in to consult on the Digitization project, requested permission to conduct a more thorough analysis of the original photograph. Armed with techniques unavailable to Mercer and Palmer, she subjected the portrait to a battery of tests and examinations. Using ultraviolet light to reveal details invisible to the naked eye, infrared photography to penetrate surface layers, and microscopic examination of the paper and chemical composition, Montgomery made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the historical community. The seventh figure, the unknown man, has been added to the photograph after it was developed, she announced in her report, presented to the Historical Society's board in September 1977. It's an early example of photographic manipulation. The boardroom fell silent as Montgomery displayed a series of enlarged images on a projection screen. The first showed the portrait as it appeared to the naked eye, the Caldwell family and the mysterious seventh figure. The second, taken under ultraviolet light, revealed subtle differences in the photographic emulsion around the mysterious figure. "You can see here," Montgomery explained, pointing to faint lines visible only under UV illumination, "where the original emulsion was scraped away and new emulsion applied. And here, under higher magnification, we can detect brush strokes, literally brush strokes, where someone has painted directly onto the photographic plate." She switched to a third image, this one a composite of various spectral analyses. The density of the silver particles in the emulsion differs slightly around the mysterious figure. The lighting doesn't quite match the rest of the portrait. Notice how the shadows fall at a slightly different angle, and most tellingly, the man casts no shadow where one should have been visible against the backdrop. The board members leaned forward, examining the evidence with expressions ranging from fascination to disbelief. "Someone altered this photograph," Montgomery concluded, and they did so with remarkable skill for the era. Photographic manipulation was in its infancy in the 1860s, but clearly not unknown. The technique used here is sophisticated enough that it went undetected for over a century, even by experts like Palmer. Only with modern analytical tools can we definitively identify it as a forgery. Montgomery's findings were published in the Journal of Photographic History, accompanied by a detailed technical analysis. The article attracted considerable attention, not only from historians and photography experts, but also from the broader public. Local newspapers in Massachusetts ran features on the Caldwell mystery, and several national magazines included brief mentions of the case in their science and history sections. "What we have here," Montgomery explained in an interview with the Boston Globe, "is essentially a 19th century version of photoshopping. Someone deliberately added this figure to the family portrait. The question is, who did it and why? Was it a practical joke, an early attempt at creating a ghost photograph, a genre that became quite popular in the spiritualist movement of the late 19th century? Or was it something more sinister, perhaps connected to the disappearance of the Caldwell child 2 years after the photograph was taken? But this revelation only deepened the mystery. Who had modified the photograph, and why? What was the significance of the added figure, and why had they chosen to place this spectral presence directly behind the family, seemingly fixated on young Catherine? The investigation might have ended there, classified as an interesting case of early photographic forgery, if not for a chance discovery in 1982. During renovations of the old Caldwell home, by then converted into offices for a local law firm, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a fireplace mantel. Such hiding places were not uncommon in older homes, often used to conceal valuables or important documents in an era before bank safety deposit boxes were widely available. The construction foreman, aware of the recent publicity surrounding the Caldwell family, contacted the Blackwood Historical Society before disturbing the contents of the compartment. Dr. Montgomery, who had maintained her connection with the society after the conclusion of the Digitization project, was called to the site. With careful gloved hands, she extracted the contents of the hidden space, a small tin box, its lid secured with a simple latch, the metal darkened with age but still intact. Inside was a collection of items that would transform the understanding of the Caldwell mystery. A child's hair ribbon, faded from bright blue to a pale, ghostly shade, a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed and brittle, and another copy of the family portrait, this one without the mysterious seventh figure. The letter was written by Elizabeth Caldwell and dated March 12, 1870, 1 month before Catherine's disappearance. The paper had been folded and unfolded many times, the creases worn thin, suggesting it had been read repeatedly. The handwriting started neat and controlled, but grew increasingly erratic as the letter progressed, the final lines slanting sharply across the page, the pressure of the pen leaving deep impressions in the paper. It read, "My dearest sister, I write to you in great distress. Thomas refuses to acknowledge my concerns, dismissing them as feminine hysteria, but I know what I have seen. There is something in this house with us. The children's toys move without being touched. Footsteps echo in empty hallways. Last night I awoke to find a tall figure standing at the foot of our bed, though it vanished when I cried out. Most troubling of all, Catherine has begun speaking to someone she calls the tall man. She says he visits her at night and tells her stories. When I ask her to describe him, her account matches precisely the figure I glimpsed in our bedroom. I fear for my family, but most of all I fear for Catherine. There is something in her eyes when she speaks of him, a kind of fascination that chills me to the bone. She draws pictures of him, always the same tall, thin figure with long arms and fingers like branches. She says he promises to show her wonderful things if she will go with him. Thomas says it is merely a child's imagination, that all children invent companions. But William has begun to have nightmares, terrible dreams in which he sees Catherine walking away with a tall shadow. Even the twins have grown fearful, refusing to sleep alone. I beg you, come to us as soon as you are able. I fear for my family, but most of all, I fear for Catherine. Something means to take her from us, and I do not know how to protect her. Your loving sister, Elizabeth." The discovery of this letter, alongside a version of the photograph without the mysterious figure, transformed the investigation entirely. If the figure had been added to one copy of the photograph but not another, what did that signify? And what connection might it have to Catherine's disappearance and Elizabeth's troubling letter? The hair ribbon found in the box was identified as consistent with the one visible in Catherine's hair in the photograph. DNA testing, still in its early applications for historical research in the early 1980s, confirmed that the hair caught in the ribbon's knot matched the Caldwell family genetic profile, strongly suggesting it had indeed belonged to Catherine. Most intriguing of all was the second copy of the portrait. Extensive testing confirmed it was contemporaneous with the first, not a later reproduction, but an original print from the same photographic session. The paper, the chemical composition, the printing technique all dated to the late 1860s. The only difference was the absence of the seventh figure. "This changes everything," Dr. Montgomery stated in an updated report to the Historical Society. "We now have two versions of the same photograph, one with the mysterious figure, one without. Both appear to date from the same period. This suggests that the manipulation occurred at or near the time the photograph was taken, not years later." She elaborated on the implications. "If we accept that the figure was added to the first photograph through deliberate manipulation, then we must ask, why were two versions created? Why would someone produce one standard family portrait and one with this strange addition? And why would the Caldwells keep both versions?" The second photograph and the letter were subjected to the same battery of tests as the original portrait. The letter's paper, ink, and handwriting were all consistent with the period. The second photograph showed no signs of manipulation or alteration. It appeared to be a straightforward portrait of the six-member Caldwell family. The simplest explanation, Montgomery suggested, is that the original photograph showed just the family, and someone later modified a copy to add the mysterious figure. But why? And why would Elizabeth Caldwell's letter, written 2 years later, describe a tall man who sounds remarkably similar to the figure in the modified photograph? In 1985, parapsychologist Dr. Jerome Blackwood, no relation to the Historical Society's namesake, proposed a controversial theory that attracted considerable attention. both scholarly and popular. Blackwood had built his career studying purported paranormal phenomena, particularly those documented in historical records. While mainstream science largely dismissed his work, his rigorous methodology and reluctance to make sensationalist claims had earned him a degree of respect unusual in his field. What we're seeing in the Caldwell case is not photographic manipulation in the technical sense, Blackwood argued in a paper presented to the Society for Psychical Research, but rather the manifestation of an entity that was present with the family, but only visible in certain conditions that were somehow captured in one photographic plate but not the other. Blackwood cited several historical precedents for such phenomena, other 19th century photographs that appeared to show figures or forms not visible to the subjects at the time of exposure. He referenced the tradition of spirit photography, popular during and after the Civil War, in which photographers claimed to capture images of deceased loved ones standing with their living relatives. Most spirit photographs were indeed frauds, Blackwood acknowledged, created through double exposure or other manipulative techniques. But among the forgeries, there exist a small number of cases that defy conventional explanation, images that show figures or forms that cannot be attributed to known photographic artifacts or deliberate manipulation. He placed the Caldwell portrait in this category, arguing that the technical evidence for manipulation identified by Dr. Montgomery could alternatively be interpreted as the photographic medium struggling to capture something that existed outside normal perception. The apparent brush strokes and emulsion irregularities, he suggested, may represent the photographic plate's physical reaction to capturing an entity that exists partially in our reality and partially elsewhere. The different lighting on the figure isn't inconsistent lighting at all, but rather the entity's own luminescence. Blackwood connected the mysterious figure to Elizabeth Caldwell's letter and young Catherine's disappearance. What we may be seeing is a documentation of an entity that had attached itself to the Caldwell family, particularly to Catherine, and that eventually took the child. The tall man described by Elizabeth is the same figure visible in the photograph, and Catherine's disappearance represents not an abduction in the conventional sense, but a crossing over, the child being drawn into whatever realm this entity inhabited. Blackwood's supernatural explanation was dismissed by most serious historians and researchers, who continued to favor the photographic manipulation theory advanced by Dr. Montgomery. But it spawned a wave of amateur ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts descending on Millfield and the former Caldwell residence. Books with titles like The Tall Man, The Entity That Stole Catherine Caldwell, and Photographing the Invisible, The Caldwell Mystery and Other Paranormal Images, appeared on shelves, often featuring heavily doctored versions of the Caldwell portrait on their covers. The Blackwood Historical Society, frustrated by the sensationalism overtaking what they viewed as a serious historical and photographic mystery, temporarily removed the photograph from public display. Dr. Montgomery issued several statements attempting to refocus attention on the verifiable facts of the case, but the paranormal narrative had captured the public imagination. It's remarkable how ready people are to leap to supernatural explanations, she noted in a 1986 interview with Photographic Quarterly, when there are perfectly rational alternatives that fit the evidence equally well or better. We have clear technical evidence of photographic manipulation in one version of the portrait. We have a family tragedy, a missing child, that likely generated intense emotional responses, perhaps including hallucinations or delusions on the part of the grieving mother. These facts don't require ghosts or interdimensional entities to explain. Meanwhile, more conventional research continued. Genealogist Martha Simmons, working independently of both the Historical Society and the paranormal researchers, took a different approach to the mystery. Rather than focusing on the photograph itself, she traced the Caldwell family line forward, seeking descendants who might possess family stories, documents, or artifacts that could shed light on the family's history. She discovered that William Caldwell had 3 children, but only one, a daughter named Eleanor, born in 8890, had children of her own. Eleanor's son, Robert Henderson, had died in 1972, but his daughter, Patricia Henderson, was still alive and living in Chicago. After months of correspondence, Simmons convinced Henderson to speak about her family history. In 1988, Henderson, then 82 years old, traveled to Massachusetts for a formal interview with Simmons and representatives from the Blackwood Historical Society, including Dr. Montgomery. The interview took place in the Society's conference room, a wood-paneled space with portraits of previous directors lining the walls. Henderson, a small, dignified woman with silver hair and alert blue eyes, examined the two versions of the photograph with careful attention. "It's strange to see them again," she remarked. "My father had copies of both these photographs. They hung in his study when I was a child." This was the first confirmation that both versions of the portrait had been known to the family throughout the generations. Asked why her father had displayed both, Henderson shrugged. He never explained it. "It wasn't something we discussed. The photographs were simply part of our family history, like the silver from my great-grandmother, or the clock that had belonged to my great-grandfather." When asked about Catherine, Henderson's expression grew somber. "It was the family tragedy," Henderson explained, her voice softening with the weight of inherited grief. "The little girl who disappeared without a trace. My grandfather, William's son, told me that his father never recovered from the loss. He searched for Catherine until his dying day. Even as an old man, he would travel to different towns if he heard rumors of a young woman who might match Catherine's description, though of course by then she would have been grown." She described how the disappearance had shaped the family for generations. "My grandfather said his father was obsessed with protecting his own children. They were never allowed to play outside alone. They had to check in hourly when they weren't in his direct sight. He installed multiple locks on every door and window of their home. The fear of losing another child consumed him." When shown the two versions of the photograph, one with the mysterious figure, one without, Henderson's reaction surprised researchers. "Oh, that's the man Catherine saw," she said matter-of-factly, pointing to the seventh figure, "the tall man who came to visit her at night." The researchers exchanged glances. Dr. Montgomery leaned forward. "Could you explain what you mean by that, Mrs. Henderson?" Henderson nodded, seemingly unaware of the sensation her casual remark had caused. "It's a story that was passed down in our family. According to my grandfather, his father, William, the boy in the photograph, told him that his sister Catherine had begun describing a nocturnal visitor several months before her disappearance. A tall, thin man who would stand in the corner of her bedroom and whisper to her." "Did William see this man himself?" Simmons asked. "No, not directly. The family assumed it was a child's nightmare or imagination," Henderson explained. "Catherine was 4 years old, an age when many children have imaginary friends or fear monsters under the bed. No one took it seriously at the time, but after she vanished, William became convinced that this tall man, whoever or whatever he was, had something to do with it." "And the photographs?" Dr. Montgomery pressed. "Do you know why there were two versions? Which one came first?" Henderson shook her head. "I don't know those details. My grandfather only said that after Catherine disappeared, his father became obsessed with the portrait, particularly the version with the figure. He would stare at it for hours, as if it might reveal some clue to Catherine's whereabouts." This testimonial aligned disturbingly well with Elizabeth Caldwell's letter, though Henderson claimed she had never seen or heard of the letter before this interview. The consistency between Elizabeth's description of the tall man and the family story passed down to Henderson added credibility to both accounts, suggesting they described a real event or experience, whatever its true nature might have been. The mystery deepened in 1993 when photographic technician Robert Chen, using new digital enhancement techniques developed for satellite imagery analysis, discovered something previously unnoticed in the original photograph. Chen, who had become interested in the Caldwell case after reading about it in a technical photography journal, volunteered his expertise and state-of-the-art equipment to the Historical Society. Working with high-resolution scans of both versions of the portrait, Chen applied a series of digital filters designed to reveal details invisible to the naked eye. In the version with the seventh figure, enhanced images revealed what appeared to be a hand, not belonging to any visible figure, resting on young Catherine's shoulder. "It's as though someone is standing directly behind her, outside the frame of the photograph," Chen reported, demonstrating his findings to Dr. Montgomery and the Historical Society's current director. "We can only see the hand, which appears to emerge from somewhere near her right shoulder. The hand was barely visible, a pale, elongated shape with unnaturally long fingers. In normal viewing conditions, it blended into the pattern of Catherine's dress, indistinguishable from the fabric's folds and shadows. Only through Chen's sophisticated enhancement process did it become apparent. This detail was absent from the copy found in the Caldwell home, the one without the mysterious seventh figure," Chen noted. "If we accept Dr. Montgomery's conclusion that the seventh figure was added to one version through manipulation, then this hand would be part of that same manipulation. But this raised a perplexing question. If someone had manipulated the photograph to add the tall man in the background, why include this additional, barely perceptible detail? The spectral hand was so subtle that it had gone unnoticed for over a century, even by experts examining the photograph. What purpose could such an easily overlooked element serve? If the goal was to create a ghost photograph or to perpetrate a hoax, why include details so subtle they're almost certain to be missed? Chen wondered. And if the manipulation was meant to document the supernatural presence Elizabeth and Catherine had reportedly experienced, why create two different versions? One with the figure clearly visible, one without any trace of it. The discovery of the spectral hand prompted a re-examination of both photographs under even more sophisticated analysis. The results only deepened the mystery. In the version without the seventh figure, faint traces of alteration were detected. Not additions, but removals. It appeared that this version, long assumed to be the unaltered original, had actually been modified to remove the seventh figure, though the removal had been executed with remarkable skill for the era. "We may have had it backwards all this time," Dr. Montgomery acknowledged in a revised report. "The version with the mysterious figure may be the original, and the normal family portrait the altered copy. This would explain the technical anomalies we're seeing in both images." But this new theory raised even more questions. If the seventh figure had been present in the original photograph, whether as a real person, a photographic artifact, or something else entirely, why would someone go to such lengths to create a version without it? And who would have had both the motive and the technical skill to perform such a manipulation in the 1860s? The investigation took an unexpected turn in 1997, when historian Dr. Sophia Reeves, researching an unrelated project on 19th century criminal investigation techniques, uncovered police reports from Millfield dated to the summer of 1870, 3 months after Catherine's disappearance. 3 other children had gone missing from neighboring towns under similar circumstances. In each case, the children, all between the ages of 4 and 7, had reportedly spoken of a tall man visiting them before they vanished. One report contained testimony from a witness who claimed to have seen a tall, slender man leading a small girl through the woods outside Millfield on the night Catherine disappeared. The witness, a farmer named Jacob Miller returning home after delivering produce to a neighboring town, gave a detailed description of the man, uncommonly tall and thin, dressed all in black, with a long coat despite the spring warmth. His face was pale, almost gray in the moonlight, and he moved with a peculiar gait, as though his joints didn't work quite right. Miller reported that he called out to the pair, thinking it strange to see a child abroad so late at night, but the man hurried the girl deeper into the woods without responding. Miller, growing suspicious, followed them for a short distance but lost sight of them in the dense forest. Only the next day, hearing of Catherine Caldwell's disappearance, did he report what he had seen to the authorities. The description Miller provided matched the figure in the photograph with uncanny precision. Even more disturbing, his account had been given before the Caldwell portrait became public knowledge. He could not have been influenced by having seen the image. "We may be looking at something far more disturbing than a ghost story," Dr. Reeves suggested when she presented her findings to the Blackwood Historical Society. The modified photograph might have been an attempt to document a very real predator, perhaps even a warning. This theory gained traction when in 2001, criminologist Dr. Alan Foster compared the case to other historical child abductions. He noted similarities to several cases in New England during the same period, all involving a tall, thin man who was said to befriend children before they disappeared. The tall man may have been an actual serial abductor operating in the region, Foster theorized. A predator who specifically targeted young children, perhaps gaining their trust through repeated contact, what we would now recognize as a grooming process. Foster's research revealed that between 1865 and 1871, at least 11 children had vanished from communities within a 30-mile radius of Millfield. In each case, the disappearance was sudden and complete, with no ransom demands and no bodies ever recovered. In at least 5 of these cases, parents or siblings reported that the missing child had spoken of a new friend, typically described as a tall, thin man, in the weeks before vanishing. The question remains, who added him to the photograph and why? Foster asked. If this was a real person, a predator targeting children in the area, what purpose would be served by incorporating his image into a family portrait? Some speculated that Thomas Caldwell himself might have modified the image after Catherine's disappearance, adding the figure as a representation of the suspected abductor. Perhaps he distributed copies as a crude form of wanted poster, an attempt to alert other families to the danger. Others suggested that law enforcement might have created the altered version as part of their investigation, a 19th century equivalent of a police sketch. But neither theory explained why the figure was positioned as part of the family portrait, standing behind them as though he belonged there. Nor did it explain Elizabeth's letter describing supernatural occurrences in the house. And it failed to account for Chen's discovery that the version without the figure appeared to be the altered one, suggesting that the tall man had been present in the original photograph and later removed, not added. The case attracted the attention of Dr. Rachel Weiss, a forensic psychologist specializing in historical crimes. After reviewing all the evidence, the photographs, Elizabeth's letter, the police reports, the family testimony, the technical analyses, she offered yet another perspective. What if we're dealing with a perpetrator who deliberately created the altered photograph himself, she proposed. A predator who inserted himself into the Caldwell family portrait, or had himself photographed with them initially, as part of his psychological process. This would explain why the figure is positioned as a member of the family group, not as an outsider. Weiss suggested that this might represent an early documented case of what modern criminologists would call trophy-taking, a perpetrator creating or preserving mementos of victims or potential victims. The hand on Catherine's shoulder, nearly invisible but present, could represent a form of ownership or claiming, a private signal of the perpetrator's intentions that gave him satisfaction precisely because it went unnoticed by others. But if this theory were correct, how had the photograph come to be in the Caldwell home? Why would they display an image containing a subtle threat to their child? And who had created the second version, with the figure removed? In 2005, the investigation stalled once more. Despite the wealth of theories, despite the advanced technical analyses, despite the historical research, the essential mystery remained unsolved. Who was the seventh figure? Why did two versions of the portrait exist? What connection, if any, did the image have to Catherine's disappearance and the other missing children? The Blackwood Historical Society, recognizing the enduring interest in the case, created a permanent exhibition around the Caldwell photograph and the associated artifacts. Visitors could view both versions of the portrait, read Elizabeth's letter, and examine the timeline of the investigation. The exhibition became one of the Society's most popular attractions, drawing curious visitors from across the country and even internationally. 10 years passed. The mystery remained unsolved, but gradually faded from active research. Other historical puzzles captured the attention of scholars and the public. The Caldwell case came to be viewed as one of those tantalizing historical mysteries that would likely never be definitively resolved, like the identity of Jack the Ripper or the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke. Then, in 2015, a technological breakthrough changed everything. Dr. Maya Patel, a specialist in photographic authentication at the Institute for Historical Imaging, had developed a new technique for analyzing historical photographs. The method, which she called spectral depth mapping, allowed researchers to examine not just the surface of a photographic image, but the layers beneath it, revealing the sequence in which various elements had been added or modified. The technique had initially been developed to detect art forgeries, particularly those involving overpainted canvases. But Patel realized it could be adapted for photographic analysis, allowing her to detect alterations that had previously been invisible to even the most sophisticated examination methods. When she heard about the Caldwell mystery, Patel immediately recognized it as an ideal case for her new technique. The conflicting theories about which version came first, the one with the figure or the one without, could potentially be resolved using spectral depth mapping, she explained in her application to the Blackwood Historical Society for permission to examine the photographs. Permission was granted, and in November 2015, Patel arrived at the Society with her specialized equipment, a custom-built scanner that utilized multiple wavelengths of light to penetrate the various layers of the photographic emulsion, coupled with advanced software that could analyze and interpret the resulting data. For 3 days, Patel worked meticulously, scanning both versions of the portrait multiple times under different conditions. The Society staff watched with growing anticipation as she gathered her data, but Patel refused to speculate on her findings until the analysis was complete. On the fourth day, she presented her results to the Society's board and invited researchers. The room was packed. The Caldwell mystery still held sufficient fascination that many experts had traveled considerable distances to hear Patel's findings. Dr. Patel's findings were revolutionary. The mysterious seventh figure had not been added to the photograph after development. Rather, it had been partially erased from the second copy, the one found in the Caldwell home. The original photograph shows the complete scene, Dr. Patel explained, displaying a series of complex spectral maps on her laptop. 7 people, the Caldwell family, and the unknown man. The second version has been modified to remove the seventh figure, though the attempt was imperfect by modern standards. She pointed to subtle traces visible in her scans: pigment residues, scraping marks, reapplied emulsion. Someone physically scraped away the figure from the second print, then retouched the background to conceal the alteration. It was skillfully done for the period, but my technology can detect the intervention quite clearly. This revelation inverted decades of assumptions. The mysterious man had actually been present when the photograph was taken. Someone had later attempted to remove him from the copy kept in the Caldwell home. But why? And who was he? If the man was physically present for the photograph, Patel continued, he must have had some relationship with the family. He must have been in the studio with them, positioned behind them with their knowledge and consent. At least initially, the implications were staggering. The seventh figure was not a ghost, not a photographic anomaly, not a later addition created to document a suspected predator. He was someone who had sat for the portrait with the Caldwells, someone they knew, someone they had allowed to be photographed with them. The way he looked at Catherine, the hand on her shoulder, these took on new significance. They were not artifacts of manipulation or supernatural manifestations, but the documented behavior of a real person who had been in physical proximity to the child. The breakthrough prompted researchers to re-examine all the evidence with fresh eyes. If the man had been physically present for the photograph, he must have had some relationship with the family. But who was he? And why had his image been removed from one copy of the portrait? In 2017, architectural historian Bradford Wilson, studying the background of the photograph, identified the studio where it was taken, Thorne & Sons Photography in downtown Millfield. The backdrop visible in the portrait, an ornate painted canvas featuring classical columns and drapery, matched exactly the backdrop seen in several other portraits known to have been taken at Thorne's studio. Municipal records showed that the business had been operated by Henry Thorne and his son Edgar from 1858 to 1873. The elder Thorne had been a daguerreotypist since the 1840s, adapting his techniques as photographic technology evolved. His son Edgar, 20 years younger, had joined the business after apprenticing with a noted Boston photographer. The Thornes were well regarded in Millfield. Henry was a deacon in the same congregational church attended by the Caldwells. Edgar was described in local newspaper accounts as artistic and forward-thinking, credited with introducing the latest photographic innovations to the conservative town. Further research revealed something extraordinary. Edgar Thorne had disappeared in August 1870, 4 months after Catherine Caldwell vanished. An item in the Millfield Gazette dated August 12, 1870 reported, "The community is shocked by the sudden disappearance of Mr. Edgar Thorne, son of our esteemed fellow citizen Henry Thorne. The younger Mr. Thorne was last seen on Tuesday evening, closing his photographic studio. He did not return to his father's home that night, nor has he been seen since. Foul play is feared." Police reports from the time indicated that Edgar was briefly considered a suspect in Catherine's disappearance, but was cleared due to multiple witnesses confirming he was working in his studio the day she went missing. The investigation into his own disappearance similarly yielded no results. Edgar Thorne had simply vanished, leaving behind his possessions, his business, and his family. Researcher Alicia Diaz, a graduate student working with Dr. Montgomery, made the connection. What if Edgar Thorne was the photographer who took the Caldwell portrait, but also the mysterious seventh figure within it? Photographers occasionally appeared in their own work, either intentionally or by accident. This theory gained support when a newspaper article from 1871 was discovered, describing the elder Thorne's search for his missing son. The article included a description of Edgar, tall and slender, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes, and an intensity of gaze that many found disconcerting. This matched the appearance of the figure in the photograph with remarkable accuracy. But this revelation spawned new questions. If Edgar Thorne was the seventh figure, why was his presence considered unusual enough that someone, presumably Thomas or Elizabeth Caldwell, would attempt to erase him from a copy of the portrait. Photographers did occasionally appear in their own work, but typically at the edges of the frame, not centrally positioned behind the subjects. And what connection might he have had to Catherine's disappearance, despite his apparent alibi? The investigation took on a new urgency. Researchers combed through records related to Edgar Thorne, seeking any connection to Catherine Caldwell or the other missing children. They found that the Thorne studio had photographed all of the families who later reported children missing, a fact that seemed significant until it was noted that Thorne's was the only photography studio in Millfield and the surrounding communities. Nearly every family of means in the area would have sat for portraits there at some point. More intriguing was the discovery that Edgar had studied briefly in Europe in the early 1860s, apprenticing with several noted photographers in London and Paris. During this period, he had apparently developed an interest in what was then called psychic photography, the purported ability to capture images of spirits and supernatural phenomena. Several letters from Edgar to his father, preserved in the Millfield Historical Society's collection, referenced this interest. "The techniques I am learning here go beyond mere portraiture," he wrote in 1862. "Monsieur Bouguer has shown me methods that capture not just the physical form, but intimations of what lies beyond our normal perception. I am eager to apply these approaches when I return home." François Bouguer, it was discovered, was a French photographer later exposed as a fraud who had created fake spirit photographs through various manipulative techniques. Had Edgar Thorne brought these deceptive methods back to Millfield? And if so, what was their connection to the Caldwell portrait and the missing children? The most significant breakthrough came in 2020, when the Blackwood Historical Society received an unexpected donation from the descendants of Edgar Thorne's sister. Among family papers and photographs was a journal belonging to Edgar, covering the years 1868 to 1870, precisely the period encompassing the Caldwell portrait and the disappearances. The journal had been preserved by Edgar's sister after his disappearance, passed down through generations of the family. Its contents apparently never shared with authorities or researchers. The donor, Edgar's great-grandniece, claimed she had only recently discovered it while cleaning out her mother's attic and had no idea of its potential significance until she read a magazine article about the Caldwell mystery. The journal, its leather binding cracked with age, its pages yellowed and brittle, was handled with extreme care by the Society's conservators. Once stabilized, it was carefully photographed, and digital copies were made available to researchers who pored over Edgar Thorne's spidery handwriting with mounting excitement and horror. The journal revealed a disturbing truth. Edgar Thorne had become obsessed with the concept of spirit photography, the purported ability to capture images of ghosts and supernatural entities. This practice had gained popularity following the Civil War, as grieving families sought connections with deceased loved ones. But Thorne's interest went beyond mere commercial opportunity. His journal described increasingly disturbing experiments. May 15, 1869. "I am convinced that the camera can capture what the human eye cannot." In the Morrisons' portrait, a faint outline appeared behind them, precisely where Mrs. Morrison claimed to have felt a presence. They were terrified, but I was elated. The veil between worlds is thinner than we realize. June 3, 1869. "The chemical formula I developed based on Bouguer's techniques has proven most effective. By adding certain compounds to the standard collodion mixture, I can enhance the plate's sensitivity to energies beyond the visible spectrum. Today I captured a distinct figure standing beside old Mrs. Winters, though she sat alone in the studio. When I showed her the developed plate, she identified the shape as her late husband without hesitation." September 17, 1869. "Father grows concerned about my experiments. He calls them theatrical tricks and worries they will damage our reputation. He does not understand. These are not tricks, or not merely tricks. Something is happening when I use my modified chemicals. I am seeing things that should not be there." Later entries documented Thorne's growing fixation on capturing what he called the visitors, entities he believed existed just beyond normal perception. December 3, 1869. "The chemical formulation I developed has yielded remarkable results. The visitors appear more clearly now. The subjects rarely notice their presence during the sitting, but the camera sees all. I've begun to hear them whispering when I develop the plates. They know I can see them." January 22, 1870. "The Parkers brought their son for a portrait today. As I was preparing the plate, the boy pointed to the corner of the studio and asked who the tall man was. There was no one there, no one visible to adult eyes. But when I developed the plate, a tall figure appeared in precisely that spot. The boy can see them too. Most chillingly, the journal contained an entry about the Caldwell family sitting. February 17, 1868. The Caldwells came for their portrait today. A respectable family, though the mother seemed nervous, constantly adjusting the children and fussing with their clothing. The youngest girl, Catherine, I believe, was different. While I was setting up the camera, she looked directly at the visitor standing behind them and smiled. She can see them too. February 18, 1868. Developed the Caldwell portraits today. The visitor appears with remarkable clarity, standing directly behind the family, its gaze fixed on the youngest child. When I delivered the finished portraits to the Caldwell home, I provided two versions, one showing what the camera captured in its entirety, one with the visitor removed, as I typically do. Mr. Caldwell seemed confused by the two versions, but I explained it as a technical error in one of the plates that I had attempted to correct. He accepted this, though Mrs. Caldwell seemed disturbed by the original image. She kept staring at it, then looking anxiously at her daughter. This entry confirmed that Thorne had not physically appeared in the photograph. The seventh figure was something else entirely, something Thorne believed he had captured through his experimental photographic techniques. Whether this visitor was a genuine supernatural entity, a hallucination born of Thorne's increasingly unstable mind, or a deliberate hoax created to frighten his clients remained unclear. The final pages of the journal took an even darker turn. April 2, 1870. Catherine Caldwell has gone missing. The town is in uproar, searching everywhere for the child. They suspect a transient or perhaps a wild animal, but I know better. The visitors have taken her. They've been watching her for months. I saw it in the photograph, the way it reached for her, the way she seemed to recognize it. I tried to warn the family when I delivered their portraits, but they dismissed my concerns. Now it's too late. April 10, 1870. I hear Catherine's voice in the darkroom. She says she's with the visitors now. She wants me to join them. The chemicals reveal more each day. They're not just in the photographs anymore. I see them in the corners of my vision, tall and thin and hungry. They know I've been documenting them. May 23, 1870. Another child gone missing in Westfield. The Parker's boy, the one who saw the tall man in my studio. This is the third. They're coming more frequently now. The police questioned me today asking if I had seen anything unusual, if I knew anything about the missing children. I said nothing of the visitors. They would think me mad. June 17, 1870. Father found my modified chemicals. He was furious, accused me of charlatanism, of deceiving our clients with cheap tricks. He doesn't understand what I've discovered. When I tried to explain about the visitors, he threatened to have me committed to the asylum in Worcester. I must be more careful now. The journal ended abruptly in July 1870, a month before Edgar Thorne's own disappearance. The final entry read simply, "They're coming for me next. I can feel them watching, waiting." Perhaps Catherine was right. Perhaps joining them is the only way to understand. I am no longer afraid. Researchers were stunned. The journal suggested that Edgar Thorne believed he had photographed some kind of supernatural entity standing with the Caldwell family, an entity only he and young Catherine could perceive. Furthermore, he believed this entity was responsible for Catherine's disappearance and, ultimately, would come for him as well. But was this the delusion of a disturbed mind, or had Thorne actually captured something inexplicable? The fact remained that both Catherine Caldwell and Edgar Thorne had disappeared within months of each other, never to be seen again. And what of the other missing children? Was there a connection, or was Thorne's journal merely the record of a man descending into paranoid psychosis? Forensic psychologist Dr. Rachel Weiss, asked to analyze Thorne's writings, offered a disturbing alternative interpretation. The journal reads like the classic rationalization of a predator. Thorne may have been using the supernatural narrative, the visitors, as a way to justify his own actions, displacing responsibility onto imaginary entities. She pointed to several concerning elements in the journal. His fixation on children who can see things adults cannot. His creation of doctored photographs that he then uses to frighten his subjects. His detailed knowledge of when and how the children disappeared. These are not the observations of a bystander. They suggest direct involvement. Chemical analysis of the surviving Caldwell portrait, using non-destructive sampling techniques, revealed traces of unusual substances in the photographic emulsion. mercury compounds, silver nitrate, and several organic compounds that could not be precisely identified due to degradation over time. While these might support Thorne's claims of using modified chemical formulations, they could equally have been employed to create deliberate visual artifacts, fake spirits, in his photographs. In 2021, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. During a renovation of the building that had once housed Thorne and Sons Photography, workers discovered a sealed wall cavity containing several glass photographic plates and a sealed letter addressed to whoever seeks the truth about the visitors. The letter, written in Edgar Thorne's hand and dated August 3, 1870, days before his disappearance, contained a confession. "I have done terrible things in pursuit of my art. The chemical compounds I developed to capture the visitors, mercury derivatives and silver nitrate solutions combined with substances I dare not name, have affected my mind. There were never any visitors, no supernatural beings stalking from the shadows. The figures in my photographs were tricks of light and chemistry, perhaps combined with my deteriorating sanity. But the children, God forgive me for the children. I convinced them to join me, to become part of my artistic vision. I told them they were special, that they could see what others could not. Catherine Caldwell was the first. So trusting, so willing to follow the tall man she believed visited her at night. A figure I planted in her mind through stories told during her family's many visits to my studio. I created the manipulated portraits deliberately, adding shadowy figures behind my subjects, then presenting both the altered and unaltered versions. I claimed the figures were spirits or visitors from another realm. I watched their fear grow, their uncertainty about what was real. It gave me a sense of power I had never known. With the children, I went further. I visited the Caldwell home at night, tapping on Catherine's window, letting her glimpse me in my black coat. I moved her toys when no one was looking. I whispered to her from the shadows, building her trust in the tall man. I did the same with the others, the Parker boy, the Williams girl, all of them. I made them believe they were special, that they could see things others could not. When the time came, they followed me willingly. I told them we were going on an adventure, that the tall man had wonderful things to show them. They never returned home. I cannot undo what I have done, but perhaps I can prevent more harm. I have sealed my formulas and corrupted plates within this wall. Let them remain hidden forever. As for me, I can no longer live with what I've become. By the time this letter is found, I will have joined my victims in whatever darkness awaits." Alongside the letter were several photographic plates showing children posed in formal settings, each with a spectral figure, the same tall, thin entity from the Caldwell portrait, standing behind them. Forensic analysis later confirmed that these were composite images created through double exposure and chemical manipulation, not evidence of supernatural phenomena, but of Edgar Thorne's calculated deception and crimes. The plates also contained images that were unmistakably post-mortem photographs of children, a common Victorian practice of photographing the deceased to preserve their memory, but in this case evidence of Thorne's victims. Chemical analysis of the plates and comparison with known samples of Thorne's work confirmed their authenticity. Most disturbing of all were several small personal items found sealed in the wall cavity alongside the plates and letter. A blue hair ribbon matching the one described in the Caldwell records, a small wooden toy soldier, a child's locket containing a lock of fair hair. These items, forensic analysis suggested, were likely trophies, mementos Thorne had kept from his victims. The mystery of the Caldwell photograph was finally solved. The seventh figure had never been physically present, nor was it a spirit captured by special photographic techniques. It was the signature of a disturbed man who had used his position as a respected photographer to manipulate a family, particularly a vulnerable child. Thomas and Elizabeth Caldwell, upon receiving their family portrait and seeing the unnatural figure standing behind them, must have been horrified. The copy found in their home, with the figure partially erased, represented an attempt to remove this terrifying reminder of their daughter's fate. As for Elizabeth's letter describing supernatural occurrences and Catherine's tall man, these aligned perfectly with Edgar's confession. He had systematically manipulated the child during her visits to the studio, planting suggestions and stories that she then repeated at home. Elizabeth's experiences were likely a combination of grief, fear, and the power of suggestion in a household under terrible strain. The story of the Caldwell photograph made national headlines. 19th-century serial killer identified through photographic evidence, declared the New York Times. Victorian photographer's deadly obsession finally exposed, proclaimed the Boston Globe. Television documentaries and podcast series explored the case in detail, examining not only Thorne's crimes but the decades-long investigation that had finally uncovered the truth. In 2022, modern forensic techniques allowed investigators to examine soil samples from the foundation of Thorne's former studio. Human remains were discovered, the bones of 5 children and 1 adult male, presumed to be Edgar Thorne and his victims. DNA testing confirmed that one of the children was Catherine Caldwell. She was finally laid to rest in the family plot, more than 150 years after her disappearance. The Caldwell photograph remains on display at the Blackwood Historical Society, now accompanied by the full account of its dark history. Visitors still report feeling a chill when they stand before it, not because of any supernatural presence, but because of the very human evil it represents. A face in an old photograph changed everything, not because it revealed a ghost or spirit, but because it exposed the calculated methodology of a predator who used the cutting-edge technology of his time to manipulate perception and facilitate his crimes. In the end, the true horror of the Caldwell portrait was never supernatural. It was the revelation that the monster was the man behind the camera all along, hiding in plain sight, using his respectability and artistic talent to conceal his true nature. The case has prompted historians and criminologists to re-examine other historical cases of missing children and suspicious photographs. How many other Edgar Thornes might there have been throughout history, using the limitations of their era's technology and understanding to conceal their actions? How many other mysteries might be explained not by the paranormal, but by the darkest aspects of human nature? Dr. Rachel Weiss, the forensic psychologist who had analyzed Thorne's journal, commented on the case's broader significance. What's particularly disturbing about Thorne is how he weaponized both technology and superstition. He used his photography skills to create evidence of supernatural phenomena, then exploited the Victorian fascination with spiritualism to manipulate his victims and confuse investigators. He created an elaborate fictional narrative, The Visitors, to justify and disguise his crimes. She pointed out parallels to modern predators who use digital manipulation and online personas to target victims. The technology changes, but the methodology remains disturbingly similar. Predators have always exploited the cutting edge of communication and visual media to access vulnerable individuals, particularly children. For Dr. Montgomery, who had spent decades investigating the Caldwell mystery, the resolution brought mixed emotions. There's professional satisfaction in finally understanding what happened, she acknowledged, but it's overshadowed by the tragedy of these children and their families. This was never just an interesting photographic puzzle. It was always, at its heart, a story about human suffering. The Caldwell photograph stands as a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying revelations are not about what exists beyond our world, but about the monsters who walk among us, those who use our trust, our beliefs, and our vulnerabilities against us. As photography evolved from daguerreotypes to digital images, our ability to manipulate reality has only grown more sophisticated. The lesson of the Caldwell portrait is timeless. We must question what we see, remain skeptical of those who claim special knowledge or abilities, and protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. For in the end, the face that changed everything wasn't the spectral figure in the background. It was the face of Catherine Caldwell, an innocent child whose tragedy, more than a century later, finally exposed the truth. Thank you for joining us on Shadow Frames. Remember to subscribe for more historical mysteries and untold stories from the photographic archive. Until next time, look closely at the shadows. You never know what they might reveal.